Presentation on public opinion. Make sure you are getting into the textbook and that you are getting all the questions answered over your worksheets. Also, make sure you're getting the information written out and completed over each of these videos, so you have all that to study for. You can always go back and rewatch any of the videos to prepare yourself for the test, but you really want to make sure you are keeping up on everything and not falling behind on it. And then make sure you are going back through and reviewing over it, so that way you have all this stuff. Okay, public opinion is described as those attitudes held by a significant number of people on matters of government and politics. Now, one of the problems when it comes to public opinion, and you have another video that's kind of going to get into a little bit more of this as well, is the fact that there really isn't one set of public opinions out there. Again, with this website, which I've showed you before already, and it's a really good one, get to pollingreport.com. Okay, when you start clicking on these things and you start looking at some of these different public opinion polls, such as, you can get into all kinds, but immigrants in the United States, the Syrians, just depending upon what the time period is, what kind of issues are going on out there. For example, this was in 2015. Which comes closer to your opinion about the Syrian refugees who want to come to the United States? Should they be allowed in? 47% said yes, 50% said no, and 3% aren't sure. Now, is that basically saying that overall people do not want them here? Again, when it comes to public opinion, there's not one opinion out there that you can say is everybody's. All they're doing, these public opinion polls, is going through and they're taking a slice of what a general population in the United States, 2,000 or 2,500, in this case 1,200 adults nationwide, are thinking at any given point in time. Notice the margin of error there is plus or minus 3. Your book gets into talking about how they get that, but again, this is a scientific poll. Even though only 1,200 people are being asked this question, they do it in a sporadic way across the United States without one section being over controlled by the other. They try to do it based upon, in this case, they break it up by the Republican, Democrat, and Independents. And you can see here the huge split that's going on here. 68% of Republicans say they should not be allowed at all, while only 36% of Democrats. So you can almost flip that back and forth, and then independence is kind of stuck on it. So this issue is really a very tight issue that you'd be looking at. Going back here into the notes, then when you start looking at some of this, okay, consensus opinion versus divided. Well, that example with the Syrian refugees is a very good one, because what you can see there is both of these things. Consensus opinion is where you have a vast majority of the American public appears to express the same view on an issue. Then you can call it a consensus. So after poll after poll after poll, if you find that a big number, 60%, 70% of people are favoring a certain position on something, then you can say that there is a consensus in the United States based upon these polls that the American public have a strong position on such an issue. In this case, what we just saw with the Syrian refugee one, for the example, is that it's more of a divided opinion. You have 47% that want them to come in, 50% that don't. That's a very split opinion. So that would be called a divided opinion, in which your polls that shows that the public has a wide array of attitudes towards a certain opinion. Now, if you look at it from Republican versus Democrat standpoint, on that same poll that we just saw, you would see very clearly that there is a consensus among the Republicans and Democrats as to whether or not the refugees should be allowed in. Republicans clearly do not want them to. Democrats say they are posing no threat. We have very good security measures put in place. It takes 2 years for a refugee to come over here, to go through all the paperwork to get in. We're not going to have a terrorist getting in here because of a refugee crisis. That's never happened, and it more likely would never happen. There's easier ways for a terrorist to get over here to the United States rather than going through the refugee process. So the results of the opinions can determine whether most Americans have either no information about an issue, or they don't care about an issue, or whether they have an extreme amount. In this case, with the Syrian one, probably a lot of this opinion is just based upon the fact that there was a fearful terrorist attack there in France, in Paris, and right after that they did this poll, and so people are basically then jittery, they're nervous, and they start hearing some of these things about refugees and about Syrians, and so then they just naturally don't want it. If this poll would have been taken weeks before the France's terrorist attack there in Paris, probably would have been a consensus to allow them in here, and no problem at all. So not only does it depend upon the knowledge of the people and the timing, it also depends upon what events is going on around the world at the time that these polls are being taken. That leads us to the second part there about the media. And the media has this agenda setting effect. The way the media informs the public about an issue really does have an effect on how the public sees it then. And we could go back into that polling report there and pick out other ones that would be dealing with issues that are very current, very relevant, the things that the media has been really reporting on. And you would find all kinds of consensus on that. Okay, and I gotta jump back here again to this. But if you would go back here to where we had it before with all the different issues on here, okay, picking one that probably is not a big issue right now, that you don't hear a lot about going on, and you can probably look through, find different ones. But this whole, okay, now Planned Parenthood, that was a huge issue just several months ago. But now it's kind of died in the media. You don't hear as much about it in the media anymore as what you did. And so then, because of that, the poll begins to shift a little bit back the other way. I'm not going to mention some people in the group for each. Please tell me if your feelings are favorable or unfavorable towards Planned Parenthood. 50% have a favorable view towards Planned Parenthood and 37% unfavorable. Candidly, and this is a relatively pretty recent poll. If you'd go back to when the big issue on Planned Parenthood came out with the videos and stuff, there probably would be a little bit less significance to that. So it just depends upon what's going on and what the issues at the time is that causes all this to take place. And that's called the agenda setting effect. Today, the media is as powerful as family when it comes to influence. Again, you're going to have another video that's going to go through this political socialization of how we get our opinions and where do we get them from. There is a big change going on in the media right now in dealing with how it affects our public opinion and how it affects the whole issue of the relevance of the issues. In 1987, the Fairness Doctrine was taken out, which what it was a policy of the United States government which said that any media that would basically be a political media entity that would report the news had to report it in a balanced, fair way, so that you couldn't give one advantage over one party over the other. Well, in 1987, under the Reagan administration, that got thrown out. And after that did, talk radio really exploded on the AM dial, with the conservative news groups really taking it over. And basically a huge conglomerate of conservative, mega wealthy individuals came in, bought up all of the AM stations across the country, a huge number of them, and they started to indoctrinate with their conservative voice. And so that's why today, if you go to AM stations and listen to the talk radio, it's predominantly, mostly, probably 80% conservative, because they've been able to do that by taking that control over. Well, going into the new media now, you got Facebook, you got Twitter, you got all these other different types of social media out there. This is where the liberal side is beginning to take its effect. They've decided not to go and try to go into radio. They've decided to go into blogs, Twitter, Facebook, social accounts, and they're finding that they're able to have a very good control of that area. So we're seeing the two parties kind of taking a different approach as to which part of the media are they trying to infiltrate into and trying to get their message across then for. So how do you measure public opinion? Well, your textbook has a really good section on that in chapter 6, dealing with how do you measure it and the accuracies of it. But what we're going to look at here real briefly is what are the difficulties in obtaining it. One of those things is questions. How do you phrase the question? Do you create a leading question? A lot of times yes or no questions only can be very misleading in a poll, because a lot of times people have both split feelings. They have both yes and no attitudes towards an answer. So by just leaving it with a yes or no answer only, that can make the poll very misleading. Also, if you're trying to make a opinion out of something, then you could word the question very differently in order to get that through. A great example of that is, again, with Obamacare back when it came out, the healthcare plan, healthgov.com. It's a very negative public opinion on it about the whole healthcare issue. Then when you break it down into its individual questions, it's overwhelmingly that people support it. So really, it just comes down to how the questions are worded sometimes. Also, there are very unscientific polls out there, fraudulent polls, and you'll see this a lot of news coverage stations will pick up on some of these polls. And you got to be very careful when you hear some of these numbers coming out on some of these polls, because you got to make sure you understand where the polls are coming from. If it's a Rasmussen poll, or if it is some poll dealing with CNN or NBC or CBS or Time, or if it's dealing with New York Times, or if it's Wall Street Journal. Those are all reputable polls, but you have to be careful about some of these other ones that come out. There's also what's known as a push poll. Push polls are misleading information in order to persuade respondents to vote against a candidate. For example, with the current terrorism crisis in Paris and what has happened gone in there, okay, if I start with that as a leading part of my poll question, talking about how terrifying it is, how horrible it is, how just brutal the death was of these people that died in Paris. If I lead with that first, then I ask you a question, well, that's pushing you in a direction that I want you to go to in an answer, and that's very misleading. The last one is house effect, and this really hurt the Republicans back in 2012 when they ran against President Obama in the presidential election. Mitt Romney really thought he had the race won, and his polls told him he did. The problem was his pollsters basically were adding poll points to his position because they thought that the polls were not accurately leading what he was showing. So they added some more points to it, thinking that the polls were kind of misleading in a negative way towards Obama. And they actually thought that the polls were leading more towards Romney, so they kind of moved the numbers a little bit, thinking that, not trying to misrepresent the polls. They really thought that the polls were not showing a true representation of where the public was on its opinion. So that's why they did that. That's called house effect. And sometimes pollsters will do that, thinking that the general public is not giving the right opinion, and so then they will move the numbers a little bit to make it favorable their candidate. Well, if you do that too much, it could really become misleading, and that's exactly what happened to Romney back in the election there. And you can see that in your textbook. There's a really good slide on this in your textbook that talks about this and shows it very well. And I was trying to think what page that was on. I think it's like 192 or 193, something in there. But it talks about that, and it shows how President Obama, the pollsters for Romney, had him winning when in fact it was, Obama had won by quite a bit. Okay, the next slide then is going to get into the difficulties in public opinion policy making. The difficulty in public opinion, giving exact guidance to pollsters, making many times people have strong personal opinions, but not public ones. So I may feel something very strongly personally, but I may not want to share it publicly. Most policymakers don't trust public opinion too much because they know what is right. That would be dealing with like abortion, healthcare, gun control, privacy, all kinds of issues out there, dealing with the fact that a lot of times policymakers, when it comes to public opinion, they will look at the public opinion polls. They see that a significant number of the portion of the country are in favor of gun control laws, but they themselves aren't. So they will ignore the opinion polls, and they will just go ahead and say that they're leading by what they believe rather than what the polls are showing at the time. Then the next set of slides here dealing with the American common opinion indifference. You have another slide that's really going to get into that one and explain, or another video that's going to explain this one. So I'm going to kind of skip over that and move right into the interest groups then. Interest groups influence government policies through campaign contributions to members. This attempt to set up claims that Congress can be sold and bought. Not only do interest groups give out money, they will give out support. They will get their hundreds or thousands sometimes, or even in some cases millions of supporters out there to jump in and to support a candidate, and they will get them to start going out and doing all kinds of things for the politician to help them win. But interest groups are something that's been around since way back in our nation's history. James Madison, our founding father of the Constitution, the writer of it, supported the creation of large republics with groups of people, encouraging the formation of multiple interests. He wanted interest groups because he believed that the more diversified people got with these interest groups, the fact is that it would discourage the formation of a huge overall group that could take over control of a government. So if you had all these smaller interest groups all over the place in our country, basically all pushing for their own issue, that would create more of a democracy, is what James Madison was saying, than it would cause a hindrance. And for many years that is the case, and in some ways that's still the case today. But there are some interest groups out there today that are so powerful, so big, that I don't think Madison even took that in perspective when he was talking about this or thinking about this. And basically, these groups have been able to dominate and control the politics of our government. Then poll data shows that over 2/3 of the Americans belong to at least one interest group, even if you don't think you do or know that you do. If you belong to a elementary school's parent association or PTA, if you belong to some local government entity, or you work for the United Way, or you try to give support to the Boy Scouts or any of those groups, all those groups are what we call interest groups. Now, are they, trying to influence politicians and deal with that? No, pretty much not. But all of those groups do have political beliefs. They do have opinions about certain issues that they want to see through. And in some cases, they will use their group to try to push that opinion through in certain ways. So the idea that, 60-some% of the American public belongs to an interest group goes back to what Madison was saying, that maybe it's a good thing that we do have these interest groups. So it gives people another chance to voice their opinion and to get their ideas out. So that gets into what's known as the collective good, the public benefits of the availability to any member to belong to whatever group they want to then. You don't have to belong to an interest group to receive, to making it difficult for interest groups to get people to join. Clean air, water, global warming, education, just a multitude of issues out there that are just locked with interest groups that you can join and get into it. The four factors that makes up an interest group so powerful: one is size. The AARP, that is the retirement people. That's a huge group of those that are 65 and over 40 million of them. One of the largest interest groups out there, and very, very powerful as well. Also the AFL-CIO, a very huge, large number interest group that has a lot of resources and a lot of size out there to really be able to make itself very powerful. Some interest groups are powerful because of financial resources. They're just very wealthy. The NRA, National Rifle Association, is a good example there. It's not a huge group. Actually, the NRA is a very small interest group in terms of its size, but in terms of its financial resources, it is monstrous. And that is why it's very hard to get any bills passed that deals with gun control because of that fact. Leadership. Again, you have some interest groups that are very powerful because they have very strong leaders. A good example there is the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee. Not a large group, not a lot of money involved in this interest group, but the people who make it up are very powerful, very influential, and they can get a lot of things done. Again, the NRA is another good example of that one. And then the cohesiveness. How strong the membership is it? Is it an interest group that is just linked together by just ideas, or is it an interest group that's linked together by a lot of other factors that makes it much more powerful and strong then? Interest groups versus political parties. Interest groups support candidates who promote their own interests. Interest groups often use lobbyists. These are the people who basically establish long-term relationships with government officials. They work in many ways to try to affect and to try to get change with our politicians. They will do it through four basic means: by lobbying, they will do it by testifying, they do it through what's called a rating game system, which what they do there is they will put out these voting records of their politicians and saying that Jim, I don't know, Smith, for Pennsylvania, the local representative there, he voted only 60% of the time with the NRA. So the NRA will put that out there, and then they will run a candidate who they support, saying we need to instead get Jane Smith to win and to defeat this other one, because she will vote 100% of the time for the NRA's bills and make sure that they will get put through. And so then the NRA supporters leave Jeff Smith and go to Jane Smith, and we'll vote for her instead then. So that's known as the rating game. So politicians are very careful making sure that they have really high ratings when it comes to those interest groups, that they're voting the way they want them to vote, so they get that 100% or 90% voting effect then. And then the last one is what's called alliance building, and that is through just basically good partnerships, money, of course, campaign contributions, all those kinds of things, any other ways that these lobbyists can give to the politicians to help them win and help them get support then. All right, that finishes up this one. Now, there is going to be a second video dealing with a little bit on public opinion again and some interest groups there, and that's going to go over another section of it then. So we're going to stop here now on this one, and then we'll come back and stop the other.